Hi, welcome back. This is the LaRouche Pack Lincoln podcast. I'm somewhat the moderator, or at least the introducer, Mike Stager, and this is with Bob Ingram. This is the eighth in a series, and I would encourage anyone watching this one to go back and look at some of the other ones. Make it a study. Bob's done an extensive amount of work over these last number of months to pull this podcast together. And it highlights Abraham Lincoln in a way that's distinct from any other biography or set of biographies you might read. And in some sense, because it captures not only Lincoln the person, but to what Lincoln was devoted. What was the mission that gripped this profound individual, this uniquely American individual? How did the American experience, the construction of our nation shape this person? And so this is kind of the last podcast. We're going to do a follow-up next week, kind of an overarching overview and discussion. And of course, as Bob and I were just saying, this is we're on the eve of the 4th of July, so that has certain merit. So enjoy the discussion with Bob today. We will have some discussion afterwards. And Bob, at that point, I guess I'll just hand it over to you and see what you got to say.
Okay. All right. The title of this podcast is Abraham Lincoln versus the British Empire. And as Mike said, this podcast will go up, on the LaRouche Pack website within the next 1 to 2 days, and it will air over the July 4th weekend. So, many people who are watching this will be watching it as we celebrate American independence. And, I would ask people to, during this weekend, to reflect on the entirety of what we've been discussing, over the last 7 to 8 weeks in these podcasts, but particularly on what I'm going to present tonight. So what I'm going to begin with is actually I'm going to read to you an excerpt from a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave on June 26th in 1857. He gave this speech on June 26th, so he actually gave it only about a week, I think 8 days before the 4th of July, the 4th of July of 1857. So he's giving the speech to a number of people as they are preparing to celebrate American independence, to celebrate the 4th of July. Now, this was a speech he gave in regard to the Dred Scott decision, the decision which essentially threatened to spread slavery throughout the entirety of the United States. And in particular, he's giving the speech in response to an earlier speech by U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas, where Douglas endorses the Dred Scott decision. And what Lincoln is addressing here are both Douglas's remarks and the deeper implications of the Dred Scott decision itself for the Republic, for the nation. So I'll just read what Lincoln had to say. I had thought that the Declaration of Independence promised something better than the condition of British subjects. But no, it only meant, that is, if the Supreme Court decision on the Dred Scott case is allowed to stand, Lincoln is saying, but no, it only meant that we should be equal to them in their own oppressed and unequal condition. Let me just read that again. I had thought that the Declaration of Independence promised something better than the condition of British subjects. But no, it only meant that we should be equal to them in their own oppressed and unequal condition. According to that, it gave no promise that having kicked off the kings and lords of Great Britain, we should not at once be saddled with a king and lords of our own. I had thought the Declaration of Independence contemplated the progressive improvement in the condition of all men everywhere. But no, in the words of Judge Douglas, the authors of the Declaration, when they declared all men to have been created equal, they were speaking of British subjects on this continent being equal to British subjects born and residing in Great Britain. And that the Declaration, quote, and he's quoting from Stephen Douglas, that the Declaration, quote, was adopted solely for the purpose of justifying the colonists in the eyes of the civilized world in withdrawing their allegiance from the British crown and dissolving their connection with the mother country, unquote. My good friends, read that carefully over some leisure hour and ponder well upon it. See what a mere wreck-mangled ruin it makes of our once glorious Declaration. The consequence of that outlook is that the object having been affected some 80 years ago, that is independence from Britain, the Declaration is now of no practical use, mere rubbish, old wadding left to rot on the battlefield. I understand that you are preparing to celebrate the 4th of July tomorrow week. What for? The doings of that day, according to Judge Douglas, have no reference to the present. But I suppose you will celebrate and will even go so far as to read the Declaration. Suppose after you read it once in its original version, you read it once more with Judge Douglas's version. It will run something like this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all British subjects who were on this continent 81 years ago were created equal to all other British subjects born and then residing in Great Britain. So that's the end of that excerpt I'm reading from Lincoln's 1857 speech given on the eve of the 4th of July. And I'm going to return to this towards the end of this podcast, this subject that Lincoln is addressing here. But I will just say for now that if you think about what Lincoln is saying, he's saying that, the 4th of July is not simply about independence or separation from Great Britain. He's pointing directly to the Declaration of Independence. And what he is addressing is that more so than just separation from Britain, that, excuse me, that there is a higher mission, a higher purpose to the American Republic, a higher moral purpose to our nation, to our republic, than mere separation from the mother country. That it is not just about, resistance to tyranny, rebellion against tyranny. It's certainly not about something like no taxation without representation, but that embodied in the Declaration of Independence is this higher moral mission. As Lincoln says in what I read to you, a higher mission applicable to all men everywhere at all time, a continuing mission. So that's all I'm going to say about this right now, but we will return to this later. So, as I said, the subject is Abraham Lincoln versus the British Empire. Now, this has obviously the whole question of the British efforts to destroy the American Republic, you know, in the 1820s, in the 1830s, in the 1840s and 50s. This has a long history, and there are many facets to it. I'm not going to go into hardly any of that tonight because it's simply too big of a subject for, you know, an hour and a half podcast, given what I do want to go into. But it just should be stated up front that the intention of the British Empire all the way through the first 5 decades of the 19th century was to reverse the American Revolution, was to destroy the American Republic. And this involved military operations, very definitely cultural subversion, economic warfare, and many, many other things. So that people should just keep that in mind as background. And if people have questions on that, they can send in their questions to podcast@larouchenet.net, and we can go into some of that. But I'm going to begin tonight in 1861. I'm going to begin with the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, and I'm going to begin with, you know, the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln and the beginning of the Civil War. Now, in one of the earlier podcasts, I went through what happened when the Civil War broke out in terms of the actions taken by the City of London, by the London banks to destroy the Union, to destroy, to prevent the United States from resisting Southern secession. That immediately, within weeks or, a short period of time of the Confederate Army opening fire on Fort Sumter, you had the major banks in London who cut off all credit to the United States, who refused to loan money to the United States, who refused to buy treasury bonds or notes from the American government. It was all out financial and economic warfare. The idea was to cripple the United States, to prevent Lincoln from raising money, to put an army into the field, and to force the Lincoln administration to accept Southern secession, and to force them to have a negotiated peace with the South. The London banks were backed up by the New York banks, the Associated banks, who basically had the same demands. I went through this, as I said in an earlier podcast. I'm just mentioning it here. The other thing that occurred is that on May 13th, right after the firing on Fort Sumter, Queen Victoria in London, backed up by the Privy Council and backed up by the British Parliament, issued a proclamation of neutrality, in which she announced that the British government and the British Empire were not going to take sides in the American War. The French government under Louis Napoleon shortly thereafter did the same exact thing, declaring its neutrality. Now, some historians, the way they interpret this is that this was that the British were not taking sides, but the opposite is the case, because first of all, while they were doing this, they were carrying out all-out financial, banking, and economic warfare on the United States from London. And secondly, you have to think about what a proclamation of neutrality means. It means that they're not recognizing the independence of the Confederacy, but they're recognizing the South as an independent entity or as a separate entity, which has the rights of what they call the right of belligerency. This is actually a legal term, the right of belligerency against the North. And they recognize that there are two belligerents, which they are going to treat as co-equals. And they announced this right from the start. Now, I mean, think about that. What if today a state in the United States, and you could even say the same thing about another country, but what if a state in the United States was to announce it was seceding, like say Oklahoma or any state, Massachusetts, that they were seceding from the United States, and the British government were to come out today in 2021 and say, we're neutral in this conflict, but we recognize Oklahoma or Massachusetts as a legal belligerent of the American government. Think about how incredible that would be. I mean, what if Saskatchewan seceded from Canada and the United States government were to say, well, we recognize both sides as legal belligerents? That's what the British did, right? Now, they didn't stop there. Since they recognized the South as having the legal right of belligerency against the American Republic, they then proceeded to arm the South. Now, I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail, because this, as I said, the title of this is, Abraham Lincoln, or you could say Abraham Lincoln and the American Republic versus the British Empire. I think it is important for people to recognize that the entire Southern Revolt was created and backed entirely by the British Empire as a conspiracy to destroy the United States of America, and that the South was armed entirely by the British Empire. And I'm going to go through in several different ways of how they did that. Now, first of all, when the fighting broke out, and the Confederacy put an army into the field, that army was primarily armed by weapons that had been seized from U.S. arsenals that had been based in the South. That is, when the war broke out, the Confederacy took control of the arsenals in the South that had weapons and artillery, and they used those weapons and artillery to arm the Confederate Army. However, number one, those weapons, there were not enough of them. They were not sufficient. And secondly, as time went on, those weapons became damaged, useless, worn out, lost in battle, captured by the Union, and they needed to resupply, a fairly vast army that was fighting in Virginia, fighting in Tennessee, fighting all over the place. And they needed to have weapons, artillery, ammunition for this Confederate Army. Almost all of these weapons were supplied by the British. This began almost immediately with blockade runners running weapons into into the South during the war. And there are numerous examples of this. At Vicksburg, the Battle of Vicksburg, when the garrison eventually surrendered to General Grant, what they found was that when the garrison turned over their arms, when they surrendered and turned over their weapons, what they found were 30,000 British rifles, what were called Enfield rifles. That was the type of rifle. 30,000 Enfield rifles were captured at Vicksburg. During the course of the Civil War, it is estimated that somewhere between 350,000 and 500,000 British rifles were shipped to the Confederacy. A minimum of 350,000 and probably more were shipped to the Confederacy. This included Enfield rifles and the more accurate, what were called Whitworth rifles. These were manufactured. These were all manufactured in London, and they were shipped to the Confederacy primarily by two business concerns in London. One, the Birmingham Small Arms Trade, and two, the London Armory Corporation. So this was big business in London. The rifles were all manufactured there, and these two trading companies then shipped them to the South. When Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania in 1863, when the Confederate troops fought the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, the entirety of that army, the Confederate Army, which fought the Battle of Gettysburg, was armed with British rifles. So the British armed the Confederate Army. That's where their rifles came from. And it didn't stop at rifles. Cannon, artillery, ammunition, all of this from 1861 right on through to 1865 was shipped into the South by the British. And I'll just mention as an aside that as the war went on, the British also began shipping huge amounts of food to the Confederate Army. General Grant reported that during the Battle of the Wilderness and the fighting with Robert E. Lee in Virginia in 1865, that the British Army was living almost entirely off of, the Confederate Army, excuse me, was living almost entirely off of British provisions, particularly bacon that had been shipped in from Liverpool into Virginia. So this is how the British Army fought. Now, then there's the question of the British Navy. Now, as a lot of people who are listening to this are probably aware, excuse me one second. During the Civil War, the Union, and I hate to call it the Union because it's really the United States of America, maintained a blockade of southern ports. But the fact of the matter is that the blockade was very limited in its success. First of all, the coastline of the Confederacy from Virginia all the way down through Georgia, around Florida, the Gulf Coast to Texas, to Corpus Christi, the Atlantic coast, the Gulf Coast, the coastline of the Confederacy was 3,500 miles long. And the Union Navy, the American Navy, could not possibly patrol and enforce a tight blockade on the Confederacy. The way this thing worked, when the war opened, the Confederacy had numerous ports by which they maintained foreign trade. Um, Initially, the chief port was Charleston. After Charleston was shut down by the American Navy, then the main port shifted to Wilmington, North Carolina. That became the most important port, and that was open almost to the end of the war. I mean, that, you know, there was a blockade, but the blockade was completely inefficient. Um, and then when Wilmington was shut down, the other ports remained open. In the Gulf, New Orleans was captured very early, but Mobile was kept open for most of the war, and Galveston remained open right to the end of the war, to the Confederate surrender. And for instance, from Wilmington, which remained open almost for the whole war, from Wilmington to Nassau in the Bahamas, it's only about 500 miles. And from Wilmington to the Bermuda, it was only about 750 miles. So these are not that, big of jumps. And the blockade runners would go from Wilmington to Nassau or Wilmington to Bermuda. Now, the Bahamas and Bermuda, both British Crown colonies. So all they had to do was to make it to Nassau or Bermuda, and then whatever they were shipping out, like cotton or tobacco or other things, would get loaded onto British ships. From there, they would generally go to Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. And then from there, they will go on to London or Liverpool. And it worked the same way in reverse. The guns, the ammunition, the rifles, the cannon, the food, the provisions would go from England to Halifax to the Bahamas or Bermuda, and then the blockade runners would run it into the South. This went on throughout the war. I mean, on the Gulf Coast in particular, Mobile, Galveston, it's estimated that 80% of the blockade runners were successful. Now, the ratio wasn't so high, on the Atlantic coast, but these blockade runners operated right on through to the end of the war. Now, where did the South get these blockade runners? Well, they were all built in England, or the vast majority of them were built in England, largely in Liverpool. They were built primarily by two individuals. The first one is named James Bullock, and the second one named George Trenholm. Now, these were both Southerners who were based in Liverpool. Bullock ran the operation to build the blockade runners. He was also, by the way, Teddy Roosevelt's uncle. Trenholm was really a very high level sort of financier, what have you. He was the senior partner of a firm called Fraser, Trenholm and Company. Initially, they were based in New York City and in the Bahamas. After the war broke out, they moved their New York headquarters to Liverpool, at which point they were based in Liverpool and in the Bahamas. So they're operating entirely on British soil. Now, throughout the war, Bullock and Trenholm, operating out of Liverpool with many friends in London, they carried out their operations with impunity. There was very little interference with what they were doing. And they had high-level people in Parliament, in the British cabinet, Lord Palmerston's cabinet, who were their close friends. and they continued to build these ships. They continued to send them out. What they would do is they would build a ship. Legally, it was against the law in England to build a ship for the Confederacy because they didn't recognize the Confederacy. So they would build a ship under some shell company, some phony, owner. The ship would sail to, the Canary Islands or to the Azores, at which point they would change its name, run up the Confederate flag, and they would then, it would then go into operation. Now, they not only built the blockade runners, they also built most of what was the Confederate Navy, including their cruisers. Some of these cruisers were very famous. The Alabama, the Shenandoah, the Florida. The Alabama sunk 65 American vessels during the Civil War, which is the largest number of ships ever sunk, either by the Confederacy or by the American Navy, by any one boat in the history of the United States. The Shenandoah continued operating, attacking American commerce, sinking ships. They continued operating right to the end of the war. And in fact, the Shenandoah was the last, military command to retire, to surrender at the end of the Civil War. All of this, the blockade runners, the cruisers, all of these were built in England, built in Liverpool, built by British firms, financed. Bullock and Trenholm were getting loans from British banks to build these things, all under the nose of Parliament, all under the nose of Queen Victoria, all under the nose of Lord Palmerston. And this is how it operated. So rifles, ammunition, cannon, artillery, blockade runners, heavy cruisers, the Confederate Navy, the Confederate Army, the arms for the Army, all manufactured in England, all shipped to the South by British vessels, right? And sold to the Confederacy. That was the actual British role during the Civil War. If you want to call it neutrality, you can call it neutrality. They never recognized the South as independent, although they came very, very close several times. But they were responsible for putting the Confederate Army and the Confederate Navy into the field. They were the ones who sustained them and armed them for 4 straight years. They were the ones who put the rifles in the hands of the Confederate soldiers who killed, Union troops at Gettysburg and Shiloh and everywhere else. So that's the actual role of the British in regard to the South during the Civil War. Now, there's much more on this in terms of the roles of Bullock and Trenholm. I'll get into that in more depth a little bit later, but what I will say right now is that in addition to producing the ships for the Confederacy, Trenholm and Bullock were also, particularly Trenholm, but both of them were the leaders and the bankrollers of the Confederate Secret Service in London. The Confederate Secret Service was quite extensive. And out of both the South and out of Liverpool, what they established was a branch of the Confederate Secret Service in Canada. This was financed directly out of Richmond by Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government. and it was financed directly out of Liverpool by Bullock and by Trenholm. Bullock, for example, directly provided money to John Wilkes Booth, which I'll get into a little bit later because we're going to discuss the question of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The other thing I would just say here, though, is, in regard to, what you might, in regard to what you might call the geopolitical or the strategic support for the Confederacy by the British, you also have, in addition to that, the support for the Confederacy by the French. Now, it has to be kept in mind that, after the final defeat of Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, and after the Treaty of Paris in 1815, that from that date forward, from then onward, the French really became nothing more than junior partners of the British. And it is really the case that, look, in the 19th century, you still had the Spanish Empire. You still had the Dutch Empire, the Portuguese Empire, and the French Empire. But unlike 200 years earlier, by 1820, 1830, 1840, all of these had shrunk in power. All of them had become, really shadows of what they had been in the 1500s or 1600s. And by the 1820s or 1830s, there is only one dominant empire in the world, and that's the British Empire. Now, part of that is simply the extent of the British Empire and the power of the British Navy. But, to a very large degree, to a dominant degree, the power of the British Empire by the time you get into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s lies in the overarching power of, Britain's control over global finance and banking, the British financial empire, centered in London, centered around the British gold standard, which we discussed, and around the Bank of England and the British banking system. And by the early 19th century, the French are really subservient to all of this. Paris, which is a major banking center, is integrated into the operations in London, just like the operations in Amsterdam are now integrated into the operations in London. It is a London-based financial empire. And the French are not going to do anything following the defeat of Napoleon. The French are not going to do anything independent of their British partners, because they're not really partners. The French are junior partners, subservient partners to the British Empire. But as the Civil War breaks out in the United States, just as the British move to back the South, the French follow the British lead. One of the first things they did is they began shipping weapons, just like the English. They began shipping weapons to the South. Tens and tens of thousands of rifles were shipped to the South. Now, in how this with the French, it worked differently. On December 8th, 1861, that is in the first year of the American Civil War, the French invaded Mexico. Initially, it was a combined force of the British the French, and the Spanish, all empires. They invaded Mexico because they charged that Mexico was not paying their debt to their international creditors. Mexico wasn't paying the debt that they owed to Paris and to London. So they invaded. Once they got established there, once the beachhead was secure, the British troops and the Spanish troops were withdrawn, and the French reinforced their troops, and they embarked on a full invasion. And over the course of the next 12, 13, 14, 15 months, the French basically conquered most of Mexico, and they occupied Mexico City. Shortly thereafter, they brought in a puppet to rule Mexico, Maximilian of Austria, a Habsburg, was brought in as a French puppet and made the emperor of Mexico. But his empire rested entirely on French occupation troops. Now, what the French began to do, because the French were in Mexico and French troops were on the border of the Rio Grande, is they began shipping rifles and other weapons across the Rio Grande into Texas. And those weapons were then transported up through the Confederacy for use by the Confederate Army, other munitions as well. This was a real threat to the Union. Yes, French troops were, on the other side of Texas, but you had a French army there, which could come to the aid of the Confederacy, which was supplying the Confederacy with, with rifles and other provisions. Lincoln was so worried about this that after the fall of Vicksburg, what Ulysses Grant wanted to do, now that they had secured Vicksburg, is Grant wanted to send troops to attack Mobile, Alabama. And Lincoln said no. Lincoln wouldn't let him do it. Lincoln directed him to send those troops to Texas instead, and said, we have to reinforce our forces in Texas to protect against a French attack. In fact, Lincoln said in one message, recent events in Mexico render early action in Texas more important than other, that we have to get an expedition to Texas. Now, as has been pointed out by a friend of mine, these French, the threat of a French invasion from Mexico really reached its peak at the same time that Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania in 1863. Now, I have no evidence that the French were coordinating what they were doing with the Confederate Army. I've seen no secret messages or anything of that sort. But it's very interesting that when the French are massing troops on the border of the of Texas, and making, and basically threatening to recognize the Confederacy, and if they recognized the Confederacy, then it would have been legal by international law for them to supply the Confederacy with troops. At the same time that possibility is very, very real, you have Robert E. Lee invading Pennsylvania. Now, for those who've studied military history, you might be, you're probably aware that Lee really didn't intend to fight a major battle in Pennsylvania. That's not what he wanted to do. He didn't want to go head to head with a Union army, on some farmland in Pennsylvania. His idea was to swing around and to threaten Washington, D.C. with his army. Now, if you had Robert E. Lee threatening the nation's capital with his army, even if he couldn't take Washington, D.C., think of the, think of the effect of this. Threatening Washington, D.C. with his army at the same time where France might possibly recognize the Confederacy and pour in French troops into Texas to support the Confederate effort. Think about the pressure that would have been mounted on Lincoln to acquiesce to a negotiated settlement to end the war, because that's what went on all along. I mean, that's what McClellan's campaign was about. When McClellan ran for president in 1864, everything is designed to force Lincoln into a negotiated settlement. That's what the British bankers tried to do when they cut off credit to Lincoln's government in 1861. That was, that's what the Copperheads were doing in the North. Everything from 1861 to 1865 is to try to force Lincoln to accept a negotiated settlement. So, and the French were playing their role all along in this. Now, I said I was going to, hold on just one second here. I said I was going to get back to this question of the British intelligence service. I need to preface it with some things in regard to Lord Palmerston and the British government. And it's a very big topic, so I'm not going to be able to do it justice. But during the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, what the British government did under Lord Palmerston, who was the prime minister on and off during all of these decades, is they created a very sophisticated intelligence operation in which, among other things, and this is truncated and this is simplified, but it's the best that I can do here tonight. They created a certain kind of intelligence operation where they began to sponsor and to create and to finance revolutionary movements in other countries, particularly on the European continent. Movements which would create, chaos, and which potentially would be aimed at overthrowing governments. These movements went by a variety of names. Young Europe, Young Italy, Young Russia, Young Hungary. And these were revolutionary movements, radicals, etc. The key person who was involved, there were a lot of people involved in this, but the key person who was involved in this was a man by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini. He's well known for history buffs. Mazzini was directly involved in setting up many of these organizations. He had many collaborators, many followers. They launched armed insurrections in many places. And, the, and, you might ask yourself, well, why were the British doing this? Why were they, trying to foment revolution on the continent of Europe? Well, it's all geopolitics. I mean, the British were intent on breaking up Russia. They saw Russia as a potential threat, to the British Empire. So if they could, create revolutions in certain parts of Russia based on ethnic revolts and other kinds of things, they had just come off the Crimean War, where they had tried, the British and the French and the Ottoman Empire had tried to break off parts of Russia during the Crimean War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, this was a rival. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a big empire, and it was a potential rival to the British. If they could break the Austro-Hungarian Empire up, into its parts, into Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Austria and Serbia, this makes them more easy for the British to manipulate, more easy for the British to control, which is what they did. If you think about what happened in World War I, when Russia was broken up into parts, the Austrian Empire was broken up into parts. It's what the British finally accomplished with World War I. But this is what they were doing: financing revolutions, financing radical groups, financing revolts. And this was done. Mazzini was on personal terms with high-ranking members of the British government. He operated safe houses in London, where these revolutionaries would be housed and conduited back and forth, all under the protection of the British government. He was protected by Lord Palmerston. He was protected by Lord Shaftesbury. He was protected by members of the Privy Council. He was financed by these people. This was a British intelligence operation. Now, in 1845, a branch of Mazzini's movement was founded in the United States. This was in 1845, and it was founded by a man named Edwin de Leon from South Carolina. He founded, he created the American branch. He created Young America. And they began organizing, and they began, building this movement, which had many different offshoots. One of the things that was created out of the Young America movement was the Knights of the Golden Circle, which played a very prominent role later on in, the ferment leading up to the Civil War, and also the Copperhead trader movement in the North during the Civil War. Now, in 1851, the leadership of Young America was taken over by a man named George Sanders, George N. Sanders. And he's a very important guy for what we're going to be discussing here. Now, Sanders was one of the wealthiest men in the South. Now, all of the, De Leon, who founded Young America, George Sanders, who became the head of it in the 1850s, both of these guys later became very active in the Confederacy. But Sanders ended up playing a much more important role. Sanders was one of the wealthiest individuals in the South. He, was very highly placed in social circles. He was sort of a social equal with Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis. He was that kind of a guy, traveled in elite circles. And during the 1850s, he held a series of positions, for the US government before the Civil War. He was traveling back and forth to London on numerous occasions. He spent time in London with Mazzini, with Mazzini's friends, Kossuth and other people, Garibaldi, all these people who were part of Mazzini's network. Sanders met all of them in London. And in fact, at one point, Sanders, where he was staying, the place that he had rented to live in, whatever it was, became sort of the unofficial headquarters where Mazzini's extended network of agents would gather in Sanders' living room or in his parlor where they would have meetings. Now, once the Civil War breaks out, Sanders comes back to the South. He goes to Richmond, and he essentially is more or less put in charge of Confederate intelligence operations. He's sent back to England, where he establishes a vast intelligence network. He's in England from 1862 to 1864. In England, he's working with Trenholm and Bullock, who are building the blockade runners and building the heavy cruisers. Sanders is working with the people who are, smuggling or shipping rifles to the South. But he's building up an extensive intelligence network, spying network, dirty tricks network. Now, in 1864, Sanders leaves London, leaves England, and goes to Montreal. And from there, from that point until the end of the war, he's in Canada, where he takes complete control over British intelligence operations in Canada. Now, there are other people up there as well who've been sent up there from Richmond, from the South. There's a guy named Jacob Thompson. There's a guy named Clement Clay. These are important people. And they carry out a lot of dirty tricks. A lot of, they're running things where they have Confederate troops or Southern sympathizers raiding the North, attacking places. They're carrying out sabotage. They're doing all kinds of things. And Clay and Thompson are involved in this. But Sanders is really the senior figure there. During that time. Now, right up to the end of the war. Now, what I want to talk about directly now is the question of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm going to read something to you, which is a statement that was issued after Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. 18 days later, 18 days after his assassination, on May 2nd, President Andrew Johnson issued a proclamation. This is Andrew Johnson, not the greatest guy in the world, but he issues a proclamation. And I'm going to read you just one paragraph from that proclamation. It says, "It appears from evidence in the Bureau of Military Justice that the atrocious murder of President Abraham Lincoln and the attempted assassination of William Seward, the Secretary of State, were incited, concerted, and procured by and between Jefferson Davis of Richmond, Virginia, and Jacob Thompson, Clement Clay, Beverly Tucker, George Sanders, William Cleary, and other rebels and traitors harbored in Canada." So that's all I'm going to read. But he says the assassination of Lincoln was carried out, and then the people he mentions the people who were behind, not just John Wilkes Booth, not the people who were hung, for assassinating Lincoln, but the people who created the plot, the people who incited it, who procured it, who directed it. He names Jefferson Davis, and every other one of those names I read to you are Confederate agents in Canada. That what is being stated here in this official proclamation by Andrew Johnson is that the plot to murder Lincoln was directed and carried out by agents out of Canada. And this is stated by Andrew Johnson on May 2nd of 1865. And at the same time that Andrew Johnson, President Johnson, issued this proclamation, he offered a $25,000 reward for the capture and arrest of George Sanders, who was directing Confederate intelligence operations in Canada at the time of the Lincoln assassination. Look, there are a number of things about the assassination of Lincoln which are very, very clear. And how many books have been written about the Lincoln assassination? Hundreds? Who knows? I don't know. And everyone's got their own take on it. But what's very clear is that at the time it was carried out, everyone in the US government, including the prosecutors in the trial of the assassins, when they hung the people who were who actually were directly involved with John Wilkes Booth, the prosecutors involved there, the Army commanders, people like Ulysses Grant, William Sherman, newspaper, everyone knew that the people who were hung, the people who were directly working with Booth, that was just the tip of the iceberg, that it was a much bigger conspiracy. Everyone knew that the plot to kidnap Lincoln, which it was initially a plot to kidnap Lincoln, which was then changed to a plot to assassinate him, but that the plot to do this was known and being directed by Jefferson Davis and leaders of the Confederacy, including Robert E. Lee. Everyone also knew that it was entirely coordinated as part of an intelligence network being run out of Canada, out of Montreal. And everyone also knew that John Wilkes Booth was an agent of this intelligence network, a highly disciplined agent of the Confederate Secret Service, that he would not have carried this out on his own, that he was a disciplined agent who took orders, and he would have done nothing unless it was cleared with or told to him by his superiors, and that everything Booth did in 1865, he was simply following orders. This is all very, very clear. During this entire time that this Confederate Secret Service is operating out of Montreal, operating out of Canada, the Canadian government allows it to do whatever it wants. It's just like what went on in England with the building of the ships, with the building of the blockade runners, with shipping the rifles to the Confederacy. The British government said, well, all of this is really illegal. But the British government simply turned a blind eye. They let it operate. They knew it was going on. They turned a blind eye because they wanted it to go on. It was part of their policy. They just couldn't acknowledge it legally. Well, the same was true with the Confederate Secret Service in Canada. You know, they're sending people to attack cities across the border in the United States. There's a plot out of Canada to firebomb New York City. There's plots to attack POW camps in the North, to free Confederate soldiers. And it's all going on for 4 years. And people are going back and forth across the border. And the Canadian government, which is not an independent government, it's a British crown colony run by a British royal governor appointed from London, appointed by Queen Victoria. You know, they know it's all going on, and it's allowed to go on because they want it to go on. So as I said, in 1864, George Sanders arrives in Montreal. He's sent there with $5 million, which he basically was given to him in London. I think it came from the Confederate government. I'm not sure who it came from, but he was given $5 million in London to go to Canada to finance his operations. It's very clear that Sanders during 1865 is the personal controller of John Wilkes Booth. Now, John Wilkes Booth, it's not clear when he, it's not, how he got involved in all this, the early history of it, it's not clear. It's known that he was associated with Young America. It's also known that by 1858, John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And it's also, almost certain that he was a member of the Confederate Secret Service by 1863, maybe earlier. Now, the Confederate Secret Service, this is not just some loose group of people. It's the Confederate Secret Service. You are an agent, right? You are part of a military command structure. And it is certain that John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Confederate Secret Service, no later than 1863. So Sanders goes to Montreal in 1864 with $5 million. On July 6th, 1864, John Wilkes Booth attended a secret conference at the Parker House in Boston. In attendance were Confederate agents who had been sent down from Montreal. Booth is meeting with them and with other people. The meeting goes on for some time. After that meeting at the Parker House in July of 1864, Booth returns to Baltimore. It is at that point that he begins to recruit people into a plot to kidnap Lincoln. So he goes from meeting with Canadian Confederate agents in Boston directly back to Baltimore and begins to recruit people to kidnap Lincoln. In October of 1864, Booth traveled to Montreal. He went out on a blockade runner to Nassau, up to, I think they went to Halifax, one way or the other. He ends up in Montreal. He's in Montreal for 10 days. During that 10 days, he is seen constantly in the companionship or constantly with George Sanders. Numerous eyewitnesses testified later that they saw them there, they saw him here. They are seen to be constantly with one another during those 10 days. John Wilkes Booth and the head of the Confederate intelligence operation in Montreal. That's in October. He then returns to the South. He's traveling around for the next 2 to 3 months, He makes numerous trips to New York City. In fact, he makes over a dozen trips to New York City. He also goes to Boston. In New York City and Boston, he's meeting with people coming down from Canada to meet with him. He's going back to Baltimore, he's going to Washington, and he's organizing the group which is going to kidnap Lincoln. Then on March 17th, and a lot of people are not aware of this, on March 17th, they put the plan into motion and they attempt to kidnap Lincoln while Lincoln is visiting a hospital outside of Washington, D.C., the Campbell Hospital. The plan is to kidnap Lincoln at that hospital on March 17th, but they screw it up. They screw it up. Lincoln doesn't go the way they thought he was going to go. They coordinate it wrong. And anyway, it falls through. So they can't kidnap him. That's on March 17th. 4 days later, after the failed kidnapping attempt, Booth goes back to New York City. And he spends the next 18 days in New York, Boston, and that environment, meeting with people, what have you. He spends 2 days in Boston. He spends a number of days in New York. Boston is a favorite meeting place for people coming down to Montreal to meet with Booth when he comes up from New York City. Now, there's no way of knowing what happens, what went on in those meetings. What is known is that they had spent months on this plot to kidnap Lincoln. What is also known is Booth returns from New York to Washington, D.C. on April 8th. And that at that point, the change is made. At that point that he returns to Washington on April 8th, the decision has been made to assassinate Lincoln. That they are, instead of kidnapping him, they're going to assassinate him. Now, the idea that Booth made this decision on his own is ludicrous. He's coming directly out of 18 days of meetings in New York and Boston with Confederate Secret Service agents. He's coming directly back, and immediately they plan the assassination. Booth arrives back in Washington on April 8th, and Lincoln is assassinated 6 days later. And then, as I read to you, Andrew Johnson issues a proclamation saying that this entire plot was orchestrated out of Canada, where everyone in Canada, all of these people, Jacob Thompson, John Wilkes Booth, Clement Clay, George Sanders, and there's dozens of them. There's vast intelligence, Confederate intelligence, organization operating out of Canada under the protection of the British Crown. So that's really what you're looking at here. Now, look, there's a lot more that I could go through. I intended, maybe we can get into this in the discussion. I intended to talk a little bit about, since this is Abraham Lincoln and America versus the British Empire, I intended to talk a little bit about Lincoln's allies during the war. And I have, a bunch of material here on the role of Russia during the war. Again, very few people today are aware of the fact that during the Civil War, America only had one real ally, major ally. It had other friends, Mexico and elsewhere, Benito Juarez. America only had one major ally against the British and the French, and that was Russia. And it was a very strong ally, a very powerful ally who played a extraordinarily important role in defending. Russia played an extraordinary role in defending the United States against the British and French empires during the Civil War. So I'm going to leave my comments about the Civil War at that. And just in closing, what I want to do is to return to the way this podcast began, which is the quotation I read from you by Lincoln in response to the Dred Scott decision, and on the question of the meaning of the 4th of July and the meaning of American independence. So I'm going to read to you right now another quote from Lincoln, and I believe I read this in an earlier podcast, but given the fact that we are going into the 4th of July weekend, and we're discussing the American Republic versus the British Empire, I think it wouldn't hurt to read this again. And this is from the address that Lincoln gave at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, February 22nd, 1861. This is while he is on his way to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as president. And it goes as follows. I have often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and framed and adopted the Declaration of Independence. I have pondered over the toils that were endured by the officers and soldiers of the army who achieved that independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence, which gave liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to all the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time, the weights would be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. This is the sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And I'll read you another short quote. This is from the speech he gave actually the day before that at Trenton on February 21st, when he's talking about the struggle. And I've read this before too, but he's talking about the struggle of the soldiers at the Battle of Trenton. He's giving the speech at Trenton, and he's talking about that battle and what the soldiers and the people involved in the battle had to endure. And he says, I recollect thinking, even as a boy, that there must have been something more common that these men struggled for. I am exceedingly anxious that that thing, that's something even more than national independence, that's something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world for all time to come. I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which the struggle was made. So those are the two quotes from Lincoln. And I'll just remind you here that Lincoln is also the president, the American figure, who said, I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. So, this is what Lincoln refers to as that's something. And what he says is, a promise for all time, for all people, to rid the world of imperial and oligarchical rule, to secure the right of advancement for our people, and to offer that pledge to fight for that for all people everywhere. That is the American Republic. That's what we're all about. And the the challenge today for all of us, is look, we're in a fight. We have people, we're fighting against treason in our time. We're fighting against horrendous things. The challenge is to rise to the level of understanding of this battle, to rise to the level of Lincoln. Lincoln understood the nature of the battle, what he was fighting against, and what he was fighting for. He understood that at the highest level. And that's what he talks about in the Gettysburg Address, where he says the question is whether a nation based on these principles can long endure. We're going into the July 4th weekend. Can a nation based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence endure? Can we win that back? Because that's really the issue of Lincoln versus the British Empire, the American Republic versus the British Empire. It's not about taxation without representation. It's not about particular wrongs, particular, things, particular evil things that these oligarchs have done and that they're doing today. The question is, can we win the population of our nation back to the principles it was founded upon? That's what Lincoln fought to do. And that's really the way you defeat the British Empire. Look, the British Empire, they tried to destroy us in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. They're trying to do it today. They were opposed and afraid of Lincoln's greenback policies, national banking, transcontinental railroad. They didn't like any of these things. But what was it they were primarily afraid of? What did they recognize in the American Republic as the thing that was most dangerous to them, that threatened their existence as the ruling class? The thing that was most dangerous are the principles that are embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And by reviving those principles, that's how you defeat the British Empire. So I think I'll stop there, Mike.
Yeah, it's great. A couple of things come to mind, which are probably worth talking about a little bit more, even though that was pretty thorough. And what struck me, especially, and Trump himself has said this, that the only other president attacked more than he was in his presidency was Abraham Lincoln. And Washington was probably close, and most people think Washington was just a beloved president, had no idea of the kind of harassment that these true patriots as president receive. And there's clearly a question of, Trump has just come out and done his first rally since the stealing of the election. And he's going to be celebrating a rally this Saturday on July 3rd. And so there are certainly comparisons, because we've seen a president nearly, politically assassinated, legally assassinated, was certainly the program. Now, to what extent attempts on his life were made, but I think everyone should take into consideration how the British deal with presidents of a patriotic American reflex at moments of great crisis. And the thing I actually wanted to raise, though, is this question of revolutionary movements. I mean, what you went through with Manzini, and you think about Black Lives Matter, and you think about this kind of movement, totally synthetic, totally artificial. Even the idea that it's critical race theory is some kind of legal shroud that it hides behind. It's pure, unadulterated British fascism and corruption. And so I think if you can address that, because I don't, besides the question of a truly a patriotic president and what we have to revive around that, around a commitment to make sure that a presidency is successful today, which has been much of what this podcast has been, I think, discussing, is the kind of citizenry that Lincoln himself reflected. But this question of these synthetic revolutionary movements, totally British sponsored, and under that context, you get, I think, the Knights of the Golden Circle became the KKK. You get all these questions, but it's really just a field of weeds covering up massive intelligence operations. It's totally synthetic. And the fact that you referenced that at that time just makes me think of what we're facing today as maybe the best comparison. So what was happening? How was this young America deployed? Can you say more about what Manzini was doing? I think it would be very, very valuable.
Well, in a certain kind of way, I mean, I'd like to actually reflect it more back on today, or just the whole larger issue of it. I mean, well, look, I mentioned George Sanders, and he is an important guy. He was certainly John Wilkes Booth handler, and the Sanders gave a number of speeches, I believe in England, where he endorsed political assassinations. He stated that he was a adherent of Mazzini's theory of the dagger, quote, theory of the dagger, unquote, which is the idea of revolutionary violence and revolutionary assassinations. Mazzini was involved. I mean, he was involved in all kinds of things. His biggest focus was Italy, but he was involved in all kinds of things. And I think what's more relevant is to think about it from what you were getting at, which is the situation today, or really there's a history of this over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Almost all of these terrorist groups, anarchist groups, violent groups, they're almost all created by intelligence agencies. I mean, everything Mazzini did was checked and cleared through, Lord Palmerston, and other members of the British oligarchy. But this is, if you go back to the 1960s, the Red Brigades and various kinds of things, these are all intelligence operations. And you look at, I believe Barbara Boyd is probably going to discuss some of this in how this works. And a lot of it is based, this idea of revolutionary violence. And you saw that come up in the 1960s. And of course you see it today, just mindless violence, rage. No great revolutionary movement was ever founded on rage, on, the people who met in Independence Hall, it wasn't called Independence Hall then, but the people who met in Philadelphia in 1776 to sign the Declaration of Independence were not a bunch of rage balls. If you're watching this podcast and people who were you know, just, hurling 4-letter words at Joe Biden or one of these people, Kamala Harris, going out, we're going to be militant, we're going to be violent, well, you're being manipulated, you're being used. I don't care what organization it is. I mean, this emphasis of Lincoln on the Declaration of Independence, that, he says, look, here's these guys. They're crossing the Delaware on Christmas Eve, and there's ice flows in the water. They don't have shoes on, they're barefoot. They're freezing to death. They're walking through the snow. They have no provisions. And he says, what is the something? What is that thing which kept them going? Which they would not abandon. And and that's the issue. The British and our own, I mean, you can look at British colonial history, and it's a history of creating, what they call gangs and counter gangs. You create phony revolutionary movements. You create, I mean, and people know today the role of the FBI with agent provocateurs. And you play, and the way, the reason it works, I mean, you could have a bunch of FBI agents saying, let's bomb the White House, or let's do this, or let's do that, let's assassinate somebody. But how is it successful? Yes, you've got provocateurs, but the reason it's successful is you have people, they can tap into people who are governed by blind rage, blind anger, and play on that, play on their rage, manipulate them. And we can't allow our movement today to be manipulated. We have to define what the fight is. We have to define the fight today to defeat the modern British Empire today, the globalists, the elitists, the Davos crowd. We have to define what a real economic policy is to, create a future, for the United States as our nation, but other countries can work with us to do it as well for their countries. We have to show people that there's a way out of this, that there is a productive future that can be built, that it's been done before. And, what these agents do is the opposite. I mean, you just look at some of these groups, we hate Joe Biden, we hate this person, we hate that person, and we're going to get together with people who hate them, and we're going to do something, militant or violent or something, that's a dead end. That's a dead end. And obviously on the other side, Black Lives Matter, all this stuff. This is all artificially created with the support of the intelligence community, the news media, millions of dollars provided to them, to unleash terrorism all over the United States. So I don't know what else to say, Mike. I mean, you might have something to add.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think there's real, I mean, I think just this question that people have to realize that the field we're playing in it's not a civil war by any means the way we confronted it with Lincoln and outright secession and the looting of armaments from the United States Army and a preparation for all-out battle. But there is a kind of cultural civil war. But it's really, it's a minority of people who are provoking it. And those minority of people seem to be controlled in some ways, with clear demonstration. I mean, a part of this was really, the stage by which this process has been set is undeniably the creation from Obama. that really what Bush and Cheney had provoked was the very instincts that you saw from many Americans, working class, regardless of ethnic or demographics boundaries or categories, that you saw in reaction to the Vietnam War. By the late 60s and early 70s, the Americans were fed up with watching their children get ground down into wars. And the same kind of response had built up in the American people, 2004, 2005, 2006. And there was a response. There was a reaction to it. And what Obama launched as a political orientation was nothing less than the same type of British program that Lincoln confronted. Lincoln saw what was happening in his country. It's from you went back a couple of podcasts ago to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, then the Dred Scott decision. It was unleashing a kind of insanity that if not addressed, the nation would be torn to pieces. Lincoln saw it. He also, I mean, you didn't address it, but maybe this is my question: is to what extent did Lincoln see the cause of where this was coming from? Besides recognizing that it was a threat, it was Lincoln's own awareness of this British hand, of a foreign hand in meddling in this, something that he was cognizant of as he came into the presidency.
Well, he knew. Look, if you look at Lincoln, if you look at what he wrote, what he said, what he did, he was explicit on. I mean literally explicit on many occasions that the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence was intended to free the people of this nation, and as he said, the promise for the rest of the world, but to free people from oligarchical rule. He understood very clearly what the British Empire was. I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time on these podcasts talking about Henry Carey, partially because a lot of people already know something about Henry Carey, but otherwise, well, anyway, Henry Carey, who Lincoln studied, who Lincoln, knew his works. Carey had written the book on the, defining the, the true nature of the British Empire as based on slavery. What they did in India, what they did in what British policy had done in India, what British policy had done in Ireland, what British policy had done all over the world, the deaths of millions and millions and millions of people, the suffering of millions and millions of people, an aristocratic elite. Lincoln actually talks about this in some point, I forget where he talks about the that in England itself, I forget where he does this, but he talks about in England itself that essentially de facto slavery exists because you have a very, very small aristocratic class ruling over a 95% of the population, which is either illiterate or semi-literate, which works in the most menial jobs, which they have no way of escaping from, which is passed down from generation to generation. I mean, Lincoln very much understood the British Empire and the oligarchical system, and they very much understood during the Civil War that it was Britain who was the real threat, that Britain was backing the Confederacy, and that potentially the danger was that Britain and France would enter the war on behalf of the Confederacy. Now, and they understood that Britain and France weren't backing the Confederacy or threatening to declare war on the North because they supported the Confederacy, because they liked slavery or something. Lincoln understood very clearly that the intention of the British and their French partners was to destroy the United States, was to destroy the Union. I mean, there were, there was no unclarity about this at all, who the real enemy was. So, I mean, as Lincoln understood it, the mission of the United States was to free the world from oligarchical rule, to free the world from empire, and that the primary enemy was the British Empire. I'm not reading into that. I mean, you might get some historian to say, "Well, where did Lincoln?" It's through everything he writes, everything he says, everything he does. I mean, I didn't go into the question of Russia and Russia's role in the Civil War, but one thing that's very interesting there, because Russia was our ally in the Civil War, is the communiques back and forth between Lincoln and his ambassador, Cassius Clay, where they're discussing, and Cassius Clay is discussing with Lincoln, the importance of Russia as an ally to defend the United States against an attack by the British Empire, that they need the Russian alliance, because without the alliance with Russia, the British Empire and the French empires are almost certainly going to militarily attack the United States. And this is what Lincoln and Cassius Clay are discussing in 1864. And Lincoln knew that. He knew that. So, it's anyway, that's what I would say about that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just so provocative how this question just, I mean, this is what was lost. I mean, you raised it, but James Bullock, you mentioned he was the uncle of Teddy Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he and I'll just interrupt you. I mean, and he had a brother, and these two Bullock brothers, it's not just that they were Teddy Roosevelt's uncle. See, one of the things that happened is after Lincoln is assassinated, the people who were, directly involved in the killings and the attack on Seward, Booth's network in Washington, D.C., most of them, or at least the majority of them, get arrested, and most of them get executed, get hung. Not all of them. But all of these other people, Bullock, Sanders, Thompson, Clay, even Jefferson Davis, well, he got arrested, but then he left later. But most of these other people, as the war is drawing to a close, as Lincoln is assassinated, as Lee is surrendering, they flee to Canada or to London, and they sit there for a number of years, and eventually almost none of them are brought to justice. Most of them live into old age. And Bullock and his brother, lived for quite a number of years, and eventually came back into the United States. And Teddy Roosevelt, it wasn't just that Bullock was his uncle. I mean, growing up, Teddy Roosevelt is literally sitting on Bullock's knees, with Bullock telling him stories about the Confederacy and what he had done in London and all of this. And, Teddy Roosevelt's family really was a Confederate family. And then, of course, it was Teddy Roosevelt, when he becomes president, who brings about the great rapprochement with Great Britain. Up until Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, from 1865 up to 1901, Great Britain, the British Empire, was still considered America's #1 adversary in the world, recognized as our primary adversary, and the country that was the most dangerous to us, the greatest threat to us. That was recognized right up to 1901, until Teddy Roosevelt comes in and says, "Oh no, these are our British cousins."
It was Teddy Roosevelt that founded the FBI, if I'm not mistaken, also.
Either him or Woodrow Wilson. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
I think it was him, and I think he founded it with Charles Bonaparte as its
Yeah.
first director.
Yeah, yeah. And the Bonaparte family were all supporters of the
Yeah.
Confederacy.
I
There
mean,
was an
it's
American
yeah, go
American
ahead.
branch of the Bonaparte family, but they were all Confederates.
I mean, it's these questions of, one of the things that this whole question of creating the Lincoln Republican Party again, and part of this question of the fights, the roles of state governments, the fights over the nature of the presidency. What's been brought back, at least some noted this after the election, was we're kind of getting back to what 19th century American politics was, that there was a very real and tangible fight. There wasn't a kind of bipartisan agreement to basically marshal in that the United States, as Winston Churchill put it, basically would become a colony of the English speaking world run out of London, which is what he says at that speech at in Missouri. Was it Fulton, Missouri or something?
Mhm.
But that this 19th century politics, that we reawaken in the American people a sense of this kind of politics, not red versus blue, but a sense that there is an enemy of the country, and the politics of the country is how best to wage war against this kind of British Empire, globalist, corporatist enemy.
Mhm.
That's political warfare. And the question is orienting and mobilizing the population in that way. The rest of politics is largely meant to deceive and corrupt people away from that actual war. And Lincoln understood it, and that's why he was effective. And to the extent the 20th century has been lost, it's been lost because the American people have lost this identity.
Yeah, well, it's this is exactly the fight we're in now. Is exactly the fight which Lyndon LaRouche knew was coming, and exactly the fight he was trying to prepare us for. If you go back to the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, what LaRouche said is that, the end of the Bretton Woods system means that the oligarchy, the empire, are going to have to move for fascism. Now, fascism is a misused term, and most people don't, not misused by LaRouche, but misused by most people and not really understood by most people. But that the post-war arrangements were breaking down, and that what you had was a drive coming out of that period. There would be a drive to crush all national sovereignty, to subjugate every nation on the earth, to impose Malthusianism, population control, increasingly dictatorial, tyrannical rule. And this is precisely what Lyndon LaRouche saw in 1971, and and everything he did. He said over and over again, "You're not going to be able to reform this system. You're not going to be able to reform this system." And most people thought well, we should try to reform the system. But LaRouche said, we're not going to be able to reform it. We are going to have a revolution in economic policy, in understanding what our nation is, in relations among nations. We're going to have to return to national sovereignty. We're going to have to return to national banking. These are revolutionary steps. And, you know, in one sense, you could call that a return to 19th century politics, because if you look at, I mean, this is what Lincoln understood. And he wasn't the only one to understand it. I mean, you know, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to build the Republican Party. But he understood it in a way and acted on it in a way unlike anyone else. But, you know, what he saw was that we were reaching a point where all of the deals, everything, the compromises, all politics is normal, that none of this was going to work anymore. None of it was going to work anymore. And that's really the kind of thing which I think people are waking up to today. I mean, if you think of the political debates of the last 20 or 30 years that people have lived through, debating this issue or that issue, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? I mean, Trump, to his credit, when he came in, recognized that we were on the verge of losing this nation. And, you know, and we recognize that. And, you know, whether you want to call it the new Republican Party or the new political movement that, you know, we're building, you know, it's dealing with like you said, it's dealing with fundamental issues, you know, all of which revolve around the question of whether or not we're going to survive this crisis, whether or not we're going to get out of this and get into you know, a future. So it's, I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, you may have something you wanted to add.
No, I mean, I think that's it. I think, as you said, I mean, Lyndon LaRouche, 50 years ago, nearly to the day, August 15th this year, was very explicit in his warnings prior to that, for about 4 or 5 years prior to that moment, made it clear that we were at a turning point, that the loss of this kind of American identity was now manifesting itself in a fundamental change in the global system. In some ways, it was the system Lincoln built. And he knew that everything had to be devoted to winning this war. And you're not going to do it, like you said, by reform. You know, as one person put it, we're going to have to refound the nation and refound this system according to the principles that underlie it, rather than simply a return to some better predicated period that we you know, the woebegones of past time.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was LaRouche's fight for 50 years. And it's certainly the question that has to be resparked. And it, as you said, is resparked in the American people. The question is a self-consciousness, a self-awareness of the meaning of one's life in that course of history, to be self-conscious that you're contributing not to an impulsive reaction, like, as you mentioned, not to rage, not to just the anger of what's happened to the nation, but also to a sense that we as the American people have let this happen. And the solution comes from us finding that better self, that better side of American identity that rises up to reestablish these principles. And that's the meaning of the 4th of July.
Yeah.
That's at least what Lynn always instructed. And that's, I think if we captured that in this discussion and in these podcasts, I think we've been successful. And I'm just grateful you took the time to prepare and develop and present these ideas.